14th century. Duccio, 1255 to 1318, Sienese artist, painter. Byzantine art was majestic, cold, aloof, showed Christ the Virgin, and even the angels as represented by symbols, and then by formalized figures. Siena kept the decorative arrangement of Byzantine painting and their brilliant jewel-like colors, had some of the luxury of mosaic, and also showed the influence of the courtly art of the north. The earliest of the great Sienese painters was Duccio. His great masterpiece, the Maesta, was ordered for the Cathedral of Siena. The various panels are scattered among the museums and collections of Europe and America. The large two-sided altarpiece with predella was painted in 1308 to 1311. The Madonna sits surrounded by saints and angels. Above her are scenes from the life of the Virgin. On the back are 26 small panels which tell the story of the life of Christ. Duccio had the qualities of a miniature painter: elegance and refinement, a jewel-like quality, glowing colors. The figures have gentle, controlled gestures. The drapery flows gracefully in soft but defined folds. The heads are given variety by being set back at a slightly different angle, but with controlled flow forward towards the central figure of the Madonna. The rows of flat golden halos carries one eye towards the throne where the Virgin sits. The colors are those of the illuminated manuscript. Subtle touches of violet, blue, sage, crimson, scarlet, pink, cream, and pale blues. The blue robe of the Virgin is not repeated elsewhere, which focus attention upon her, but the touches of red where her dress is exposed and the drapery over the arms of the throne link her to the figures on both sides of her. The figures are impersonal, but Duccio shows himself to be a master of design and color used to create a flow of movement in a world of people with their eyes on heaven and their thoughts concentrated on the next world rather than this one. On the back of the altarpiece, scenes from the Passion include a marvelously designed crucifixion, and on the other panel, the entry into Jerusalem. 7. Yeah. Florentine. Giotto completely abandoned the Byzantine tradition, little in common with the Sienese in the matter of technique. Giotto regards himself as a narrative painter. His concern was to tell his story by establishing the emotional relationship between the figures in his frescoes. This inhumanizing religion doubtless gave Giotto the courage to humanize art. In fact, he brought his characters down to earth. They are recognizable human beings, identifiable with the types walking about the streets of Florence or with the monks at Assisi. In the famous fresco of St. Francis and the Birds of Assisi, the saint is a contemporary monk talking to the birds. There is nothing saint-like about him, except for his halo, and the monk behind him shows the human emotion of astonishment at the fact that the birds are listening. Even more remarkable, Giotto places his characters in familiar surroundings, observed from nature. He abandoned the use of gold sky, symbolizing heaven. Instead, he is interested in showing how delicately the sky lightens as it touches the horizon. He does not use the shapes of leaves and flowers as flat pattern and design, but he noticed that leaves group together and produce larger forms, and that the branches of the trees are lost behind them and then emerge again, and he accentuates the third dimension by light and shade instead of relying on outline for his effect. His drapery, though simplified, reveals the solidity of form beneath. Three sets of frescoes sum up his achievements. 1. The St. Francis cycle in the chapel of St. Francis of Assisi. 2. The Arena Chapel frescoes at Padua. 38 scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary. Here is shown the famous Lamentation. Three, the frescoes in the Bardi Chapel in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, painted 10 years later, shown here left of the Peruzzi Chapel, a later addition. Giotto was entirely liberated and absorbed in the world of 13th and 14th century Florence. Another example of his work, the flight into Egypt, Padua, with extreme economy of detail, Giotto forcefully and simply tells the story so that the humblest in any congregation could understand it. Mary holds the child protectively seated on the realistic donkey. This is the focal group and is given preeminence over the other figures. Joseph leads the way. His cloak links him to the donkey and stresses the animal's forward plodding. Above, an angel in a rhythmic flight protects the route and encourages them on. Figures move across a landscape that is merely indicated enough to show that they're on a cross-country journey. Masaccio. With the death of Giotto, 1337, there was a period of near stagnation in Florence until in 1401 a painter called Masaccio was born. He died in 1428 in Rome when he was only 27. In Masaccio's frescoes in the Brancassi Chapel of the Carmine Church in Florence, there is no trace of the illuminator or of the old Byzantine tradition. For here, after a pause of a century, is the first true successor to Giotto. Comparing Giotto's frescoes in Padua with Masaccio's series in the Brancassi Chapel, it becomes evident that during the century that had elapsed between the two, man's intellectual grasp of his environment had taken a considerable stride forward. Giotto's figures, his landscapes and architectural backgrounds are generalized besides Masaccio's. For the first time in the history of painting, the Brancassi Chapel frescoes by Masaccio present us with a completely articulated world, the subject of which is the tribute money. Painted during the mid-1420s in the Brancassi Chapel in Florence, which was commissioned by the wealthy silk merchant Michael Brancati, the subject of which was seen through the life of St. Peter. The painting relates the story of how St. Peter, at Christ's bidding, catches a fish and draws from its mouth a sum of money sufficient to satisfy the demands of the tax collector. This picture shows Masaccio's ability to paint solid, weighted figures which were as solidly planted on the ground as those of Giotto. But the awkward, lumpy quality of the earlier artist had been left behind. The landscape becomes more realistic and the figures more individual. Yet also dealt with is the problem of foreshortening posed figures and the use of light falling across from a single source. Masaccio's work was to prove an inspiration to generations of artists. He also recaptures, after a pause of a century, the central belief of a Hellenic artist that the human body is both noble and beautiful, and to this he added human emotion. Example, his painting of Adam and Eve, the first nude figures since ancient Roman times. Masaccio fused his new grasp of material reality with Giotto's sense of expressive gesture. 15th century Florentine sculpture, Ghiberti and Donatello. The two sculptors, Ghiberti and Donatello, represent the two streams of Italian art, respectively. Ghiberti is seeking to gather together all the various elements which make a work of art into a single harmony, where no single element outshines another. Donatello is seeking dramatic effect and a certain grandeur, as seen here in his David. The first part of Ghiberti was to lead to such great giants of the High Renaissance, Raphael; the second, Donatello, to Michelangelo. Thirteen 1378 to 1455. There were three Florentine contestants for the baptistry doors in Florence: Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Eventually, the panel submitted by Ghiberti won. With the first door by Ghiberti, no attempt has been made to render a sense of great depth. Nevertheless, he places his figures on three clearly defined levels. In the foreground, lower left, are two youths deep in conversation, and a donkey. In the middle distance is a figure of Abraham, knife in hand, held ready to strike an Isaac kneeling upon a sacrificial altar. The figure of an angel who hurries to stop Abraham's hand and a ram caught in the thick are placed on the third level of distance. Ghiberti worked for 20 years on the doors with the 28 panels. During that time, his workshop became one of the focal points for artistic activity in Florence. During this time, he was also offered a number of additional commissions, including the third baptistry door. The first panel seen here is really a late medieval work groping towards a classical style. This second panel is completely a work of the Renaissance. The handling of the three-dimensional space is what strikes one most forcefully. The arches of the building seem to recede one behind the other, and to carve a deep three-dimensional stage for the background figures. This sensation of space is emphasized by features such as the lines of the floor tiles and by the figures and other objects diminishing in size the further back in space they are placed. We are seeing here the example on the north door. Donatello, 1386 to 1466. He was responsible for many superb statues like this St. George in Florence and elsewhere. His work reflects a complex, intense alertness and a powerful personality, and immediate swift action is powerfully suggested. Another example of his work is the freestanding bronze David, the first freestanding nude figure since classical times. Shows a classical stimulus about these poses, yet alertness typical of Donatello. The equestrian statue of Gattamelata is another wonderful bronze by Donatello, set in the Piazza in Padua. It has qualities similar to that of St. George, a perfectly controlled figure, a warrior on a powerful horse. It is always interesting to compare this with the statue by Verrocchio in Venice. The beginning of a recognized Italian style was to be found in sculpture a little earlier than in painting. Nearly all the great sculptors were Florentine. Carved in wood for the baptistry of Florence, it shows a distinctly anti-classical style. Paolo Uccello, 1397 to 1475. The painter Paolo Uccello demonstrates the aspect of Renaissance thinking, where the greatest engineers of the period could also be a noted sculptor or painter. Here is an example of his most important work, the Battle of San Romano, painted between 1456 and 1460. The subject is the battle between the Sienese and the Florentines. Uccello was a very talented painter, yet the aspect of his art which interested him was a mathematical one, the problem of perspective. He was quite prepared to endure poverty, the anger of his wife, the scorn of his friends, in pursuance of his obsession with perspective. He delighted in drawing perspective views of the most complex objects. His paintings have a curious charm. His horses and figures often looked like clockwork dogs dashing about on a painted cardboard stage. Horses might be entirely red, green, or white, whichever he thought suited the composition best. He was also interested in the study of Oriental art, and this is reflected in his work. Due to his lifelong researches in perspective, generations of artists who came after him were able to achieve so much perfection with so little apparent effort. The central figure in one of these panels is probably the Sienese commander, who is being shown being unhorsed. As in the previous scene, the broken weapons in the foreground recede neatly in perspective, and Uccello had deliberately depicted several of his horses in different poses to show off his skill in foreshortening. The landscape in the background shows isolated figures continuing to fight. Uccello was one of the first artists to be noted for his accuracy in landscape backgrounds, which provide an interesting backdrop to the main subject of the painting. Also his placing of this figure in profile, which carries one's eye into the picture, illustrates his skill and accomplishment in perspective. Here is a typical example of Uccello's obsession with perspective. It is entitled The Chalice. Work in Florence. Botticelli. Botticelli lived during the great age of patronage under the Medici power. His early work was influenced by Greek mythology. For example, The Birth of Venus, Uffizi Gallery, Florence. In this painting, Venus has emerged from the sea on a shell, which is driven to shore by flying winged gods amidst a shower of roses. As she is about to step onto land, one of the nymphs receive her with a purple cloak. This painting forms a perfectly harmonious pattern. The graceful outline and movement of his composition recalls the Gothic tradition. For example, the gentle sway of the body and the exquisite fall of the drapery, along with the liberties which he has taken with nature. For example, the unnatural length of her neck and steep fall of her shoulders, and the odd way her left arm is hinged to her body, all add to the beauty and harmony of the design in the painting. His later work is more austere and was influenced by the Dominican preacher Savonarola and puritanical influence. This is exemplified here in the work titled Calumny. Both the subject matter and the treatment are of very austere approach. Jan van Eyck, 1385 to 1441. The greatest Flemish painter during the 14th century was Jan van Eyck. His work was characterized by a remarkable photorealistic quality as a visual recorder. He perfected a new medium of oil painting and developed oil glazing technique to seal in his colors. The exacting detail and sharp definition of his pictures show a Gothic influence, a dominating factor in the Northern Renaissance. This example of his work, the Arnolfini Marriage. In the painting, the artist takes the place of the camera to record every minute detail of the event. He even records his name as a witness over the mirror on the back wall of the painting. Many of the elements in the painting are symbolic. For example, the dog represents fidelity, the discarded shoes indicate holy ground, the rosary beads on the wall are a religious reference, and the single candle on the chandelier is a nuptial symbol. The frame of the mirror contains 10 scenes of the Passion, perhaps reminding one of the bride's pious upbringing. This painting is in the National Gallery, London. Another example of his work in the Ghent altarpiece, started by Hubert in 1415 and completed by Jan in 1426. This altarpiece is a good example of the folding altarpiece typical of Northern Europe. When closed, it represents a monochrome of the Annunciation and portraits of the donors. The Annunciation occupies the four central panels. Above are the prophets and sibyls. In the lower panels are the donors, Jos and his wife Isabella, and in the two center panels, St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. When open, the interior is arranged in two tiers, the upper representing the heavenly sphere, the lower representing the earthly sphere. The central figure of the upper row is God the Father. On his right are three panels, the Virgin, singing angels, and Adam. On the left are also three panels, John the Baptist, musical angels, and Eve. The central panel in the lower space is the Adoration of the Lamb, with two panels on the right, the Knights of Christ and the Last Judges, and two panels on the left, the Hermits and the Pilgrims. The Adoration of the Lamb is a symbol of the sacrifice of Christ. The Lamb stands on the altar with blood flowing into a chalice. In the foreground is the fountain of life. High above the Lamb, a dove represents the Holy Spirit and sheds rays of divine love on all who have come to glorify God. The singing angels' expression on their faces demonstrates Jan's concern to show them as individual characters. The figures of Adam and Eve introduced the first nude paintings in Northern art. Jan van Eyck was also the first to show that landscape lightens as it goes into the distance, which is called atmospheric perspective. The High Renaissance in Tuscany and central Italy was brought about by three great men, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. In him we find scientific curiosity on the one hand and mystical romanticism on the other. He trained in the studio of Verrocchio. Here is a detail of Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ by St. John the Baptist. The angel on the left is the work of Leonardo da Vinci, as is the background. Pieces of painting, but some fascinating drawings cover the whole field of his researches, both scientific and artistic. Here is a detail from his flying machine. In fact, some of his experiments with new types of medium caused his paintings to disintegrate, even in his own lifetime. Here, for example, The Last Supper in Milan. In this painting we see Christ and the 12 disciples are seated. Christ, with outstretched hands, has just said, "One of you will betray me." At this statement, a wave of intense excitement passes through the groups, as each asks, "Is it I?" In the center of the Last Supper is the figure of Christ in perfect repose, isolated from the disciples, framed by the central window at the back and the sides, and by the curved line over the opening, and the focal point of all the lines in the composition. Into this reposeful framework are fitted four groups of agitated disciples, united among themselves and also to one another by a movement of the hand, a gesture of the arm, or a turn of the head. The two figures at the end are more quiet, as if to frame in the movement which grows more intense as it approaches the figure of Christ. This painting marks a climax in picture construction and is an example of a classical side of the High Renaissance. The few masterpieces he left behind are sufficient to place him as the first great painter of the Tuscany High Renaissance. For Michelangelo and Raphael, man was a center and meaning of the universe. For Leonardo da Vinci, man was only an incident in a universe he was never tired of trying to understand. The lakes and valleys and mountains range behind the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa and Virgin of the Rocks shown here represent the romantic side of the High Renaissance. These Renaissance artists anticipated by 3 centuries the late watercolors of Turner in the 19th century. Here is a fine example of his work. Mona Lisa is simply dressed with no ornaments, and her hair falls in loose ringlets covered by a thin veil. In this painting, we see a new painting technique called sfumato. No hard lines, the shapes are incomplete. Da Vinci does not think in outline, but how the objects intercept the light that falls on it with blurred outlines and mellowed color. One on the right and one on the left. If you block out the one on the left, the figure seems smaller. If you block out the one on the right, the figure seems taller. Michelangelo, 1475 to 1564. Leonardo da Vinci was universal and diffused in his quest. Michelangelo, passionately narrow and single-minded. Leonardo's desire was to understand, Michelangelo's to create. Neither considered painting a means to an end. Sculpture was Michelangelo's ideal means of expression. Michelangelo chose to make the human body express everything he had to say. His figures inhabit no planet, no particular quality of light falls on them, no air surrounds them. He used the human body as an empty vessel to pour himself into. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, which he completed in 1512, is a collection of single or pair of figures. Compared with Leonardo's Last Supper, in which the 13 men are bound together by a continuous trend of drama and design, each in this case is inseparable from his neighbor. This is not the case in the Sistine Chapel figures. Each one is a self-contained invention with a gesture and a mood of its own. The 16 square yards of the carved ceiling took 4 years to complete. The end wall of the chapel was completed 30 years later. The subject was the Last Judgment, 1536 to 1541, size 45 feet by 40 foot, commissioned by Pope Paul III to adorn the altar wall. It was largely inspired by Dante's Inferno. In the center of the fresco is the rather athletic figure of Christ the Judge, surrounded by an array of light. Saint Bartholomew sits on a cloud at his feet, holding a frayed skin on which the artist has painted a tragic self-portrait. In the lower part of the fresco, Michelangelo painted the figures of the damned being dragged down to hell. One soul has abandoned all hope, and he covers his face in sheer terror and despair. When it was unveiled, controversy raged about the nudity of the figures, and it was decided to give all the figures loincloths of drapery. The task was carried out soon after Michelangelo's death by a team of artists nicknamed the Breeches Makers. The Sistine Chapel ceiling and end wall is the most powerful single creative effort ever made by an artist. Only Giotto's frescoes in the interior of the Arena Chapel in Padua, painted nearly 2 centuries earlier, and Tintoretto's painting in San Rocco in Venice, started 60 years later, can be compared with it. The subject matter of the Sistine Chapel was to tell the story of the creation of Adam. The creation of Eve, the fall of man, and the expulsion from the garden. The flood. The purpose of the ceiling was to glorify man as a creator of infinite beauty and nobility and power. The central panel in which the story of the book of Genesis is told is contained within a painted cornice that runs horizontally along the length of the chapel and is cut across it from side to side. On each intersection of the cornice and pilaster is seated a nude athlete, a young man of perfect physique in an attitude in which rhythmic grace and power are combined as never before. In fact, each one of the Sistine Chapel athletes, sibyls, prophets, is a statue manique. An example of this is the creation of Adam. Here we see the listless body of Adam about to be animated by the Spirit of God at the gentle touch of fingertips, which is the center and focus of the painting. Adam is lying on the ground in all the vigor and beauty that befits the first man. On the other side, God the Father is approaching, carried and supported by his angels, wrapped in a wide and majestic mantle, blown out by the wind like a sail. As he stretches out his hand, not even touching Adam's finger, we almost see the first man wakening as from a profound sleep and gazing into the face of his Maker. Another example, the creation of sun, moon, and stars, which is one of Michelangelo's most original conceptions. The dramatically powerful figure of the Creator is shown in daring foreshortening. Sculpture by Michelangelo. David, 1501 to 1504. It is over 18 foot high and in the Academy in Florence. In 1501, Michelangelo returned to Florence to undertake the task of carving the statue of David from a block of marble which some 40 years earlier another sculptor had begun to carve a figure and bundled the attempt. The figure of David was to symbolize the republican virtues of courage and fortitude. Michelangelo chose to show David just before his battle with Goliath. The young biblical hero stands with his sling over his shoulder, frozen in a pose of tense anticipation and defense. Other examples are the four figures of, firstly, day and night from the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, and the figures of dawn and dusk from the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici. Two Pietas, one in Florence Cathedral, the other in St. Peter's, Rome, shown here. The Florentine Pieta expresses unbearable intensity of sadness and yet reveals tremendous power in its execution. Those figures occupy little more than the space of one. Note the super-modeling of the loosely hanging arm and the crumpled legs. This work of art is one of Michelangelo's most human achievements. Compare this with the previous Pieta in St. Peter's of an earlier date, when Michelangelo was still rendering the classical ideal of beauty in the human figure. Here the mother is sorrowing over her dead son quietly and alone. In the later carving, Michelangelo expresses far deeper emotion and twists the figures in torment. His last great work, the Entombment Group, the Pieta in Florence Cathedral, contains the whole of his extraordinary genius. Michelangelo once said that sculpting a figure was like liberating the figure from the marble that imprisoned it. He would select his block of marble and visualize the figure imprisoned in it. Then, when he started to carve, each chiseled stroke permitted him more and more to a specific conception of the figure imprisoned in the block, and the figure would only be liberated if he had the right shape to begin with. In the caves at Carrara, many unsuccessful figures which were never freed from the marble were found after his death. But even his unfinished works have captured the movement that he tried to put into all of his creations. The awakening of a slave. These figures seem to be struggling to free themselves from a stone. They were originally destined for the tomb of Julius de Medici. Before moving on from Michelangelo, we must not forget the beautifully designed Swiss Guards uniform outside the Vatican, which is used still today. They were designed by Michelangelo. Raphael, 1483 to 1520. Raphael was born in Urbino. He was apprenticed to the painter Perugino. His arrival in Florence brought him into contact with Leonardo and Michelangelo. The researches which he conducted in that city helped him to formulate the ideals of beauty found in so many of his religious paintings. His Madonnas with pure oval faces are gracefully posed in pastoral settings with soft blue hills and clear luminous skies. Raphael's calm, harmonious treatment is ever present. No hint of future events is allowed to disturb the total harmony. In 1508, Pope Julius summoned Raphael to work in the Vatican. At the very same time, Michelangelo was about to commence work on the Sistine Chapel. The frescoes which Raphael executed in the Vatican marked the high point of his career. The School of Athens and the Disputer are among the most important painted on the walls of the Pope's private library. They also marked the flowering of Italian High Renaissance culture. In these frescoes, everything is reconciled. Philosophy of the ancient with the ideas of the church. The world of human endeavor with God and with nature. Here, the School of Athens suggests the ideals of order. Here is perspective perfectly employed to create an architectural setting with groups of people in it who argue, gesticulate, and draw. Notice the group on the right, for instance, who seem so interested in the geometrical drawings being made by the man with the bald head. This figure is probably a portrait of Bramante, very appropriate since the imposing architectural setting for the picture represents Bramante's concept for the new St. Peter's. Note how your eye moves from this group to the line of figures behind, and from there on to two center figures who are obviously important. On the left stands Plato, probably a portrait of Leonardo, who points to heaven. On the right, Aristotle. The groups who distribute themselves so harmoniously on both sides of the composition represent various aspects of philosophy, science, and mathematics. Raphael's fresco gives a very clear idea of the highest aspirations of his age in the field of architecture. Raphael's intellectual concept of beauty was to leave its mark in European painting up to almost the beginning of our own century.
Go.
The Venetian School, 16th century. To the Venetians, colour and design are inseparable. To the Florentines, colour was a quality to be added to design. The gay and colourful life of pageantry and grandeur in Venice is reflected in its art, and also the fact that Venice was a port for the East. They used atmospheric perspective rather than the linear mathematical variety used by the Florentines. The first of these great Venetian painters was Giovanni Bellini, 1430 to 1516. His paintings are bathed in light and colour, which are rich in detail, atmosphere, and colour. He never allowed to destroy his own sense of structure and design. He had the ability to give full expression to all these elements. Most of his work is of a religious nature. This example, the procession of the True Cross in St. Mark's Square, Venice, shows Venice unchanged even today. Titian, 1477 to 1576. Titian's paintings matured late. By the end of his long life, he had explored most of the possibilities of which oil painting was capable. He had proved himself a master of every kind of subject. His influence as a master of the full range of expression of pigment had been felt by almost every European artist of note. In fact, Titian set his foot on the road that led directly to 19th century Impressionism. He did not paint the thing as he knew it to be, but as he saw it. For example, here a green hillside can be purple if it is in a brown field scarlet if it is seen at sunset. In all his paintings there is a use of light that ties all the parts together and in particular binds the figures and the landscapes into a single harmony. Landscape had not yet reached the point where it could exist in its own right without the justification of figures. Venetian landscape fuses itself intimately with the figures, whereas in Florentine painting it was seldom more than a theatre backcloth. Here is a typical example of his painting done during the Middle Years, Bacchus and Ariadne. The Frari Assumption, painted between 1516 and 1518, shows a woman as shapely as all women, painted by Titian, is brought up to heaven by a swarm of angels, while below the apostles regard anxiously, and above the eternal Father welcomes her. The life-size figures who are bathed in light harmonize with the large windows of the apse of the Frari. The Assumption had the grandeur and the awe of Michelangelo, the charm and loveliness of Raphael, and the true colour of nature. Then, in old age, we find the remarkable kind of painting, as in The Crowning with Thorns. The figures in this painting emerge from the semi-darkness, their flesh tones glowing in the harsh lamplight. Inevitably, your eye must follow the thrust of the lash as they batter Christ's head. Architecture is there, but almost totally lost in the shadow. Titian was also a painter of life-size portraits. Here is an example: the man with the blue sleeve, a wealthy merchant. Also painted aristocrats, the Pope and emperors. His last tragic picture, the Pieta, was left unfinished at his death in 1576. Tintoretto, 1518 to 1594. A pupil of Titian, Tintoretto absorbed his master's concept of colour, but combined it with an approach to drawing which is derived from Michelangelo. Titian bathed his paintings in atmosphere, dispensed with outline, and heightened the lights, but Tintoretto intensified the shadow and silhouetted his figures. He seldom presented a character full face, but turning away, or with head and shoulders foreshortened, as here in St. George and the Dragon, where the foreshortened figure of the princess comes fleeing towards us. The depth of shadow from the waist thrusts her shoulders forward, the head turns away, one side being deeply in shadow. The flowing silken robe swirls back towards the body of the dead man, again silhouetted against the dark earth. St. George further plunges us into the composition. The pale hindquarters of the horse stand out from the darkness of the trees. His forward thrust is checked by the firm dark shape of the dragon's wings, and the sky is a vision of glory, illuminating the battlements of the castle, and catching the knight's armour, and drenching the sea with light. From 1576 until 1588, he painted a series of over 60 huge paintings depicting the lives of the Virgin and of Christ in the Scuola Rocco in Venice, unsurpassed in their splendour and in the boldness of their conception. His works reveal to the full Tintoretto's use of unusual viewpoints, contrasts of scale, and visionary effects of light. Here is a good example: His Last Supper from the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore. Seventeenth-century painting, Rembrandt, 1606 to 1669. Rembrandt was one of the great portrait painters in the history of art. His earliest success with a group portrait was a group portrait of Amsterdam surgeons known as The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Chubb. In this painting he vividly portrays Dr. Chubb, complete with partially dissected corpse lecturing to a group of guild members. Rembrandt had the ability to convey a psychological rather as well as a physical description of the sitter. He enjoyed much popularity, and his fame as a portrait painter earned him many commissions. But in 1642 his luck ended, his wife died, and he painted a famous picture, The Night Watch, which caused his reputation as a portrait painter to suffer, and his prosperity ended as a consequence. The Night Watch. Looking at this large painting, one gets the feeling that the volunteers are ready to march. The small boy running off to the left and the dog barking at the drummer at the right add to the restlessness of the composition. Traditionally, group portraits were presented in static poses, giving each person equal importance. In The Night Watch, Rembrandt has presented the volunteers in a variety of poses and groups, yet he has kept the composition united. The dramatic use of bright highlights on the dark, shadowy background is typical of Rembrandt's technique. The highlighted figure of a woman, perhaps Rembrandt's wife, among the all-male company caused much controversy, along with the fact that all the members were not given the same prominence. This Rembrandt continued to paint, concentrating more and more on religious themes, both in painting and etching. In his religious pictures, Christianity, for the first time since Giotto, became an affair of ordinary men and women. He also got his inspiration from the world as he found it, a queer place full of slums, castles, merchants, and beggars, as seen in this etching. Rembrandt painted some 60 self-portraits. They provide us with a visual documentary of his character and personality. 17th century Baroque. The Baroque style evolved at the beginning of the 17th century. It transformed the artistic and architectural style and appearance of Rome. It found its expression in the great ceiling paintings of the church and palaces of Europe. Caravaggio, in his Calling of St. Matthew, 1599, showed light and shade and diagonal composition in a very dramatically expressed manner. He also liked to paint people around him. Most of Caravaggio's paintings were of religious themes. The influence of Caravaggio's style was felt by artists in both Italy and other European countries. He lived from 1573 to 1610, born in a small Lombardy town of Caravaggio, hence his name. At first, many of the patrons of the time rejected his work because the stark realism of his technique was a rejection of the idealism of the classical Renaissance. Work was also a reaction against the exaggerated mannerist style of his contemporaries. Caravaggio's use of light and shadow, combined with detailed execution, gave his picture a sense of drama. Many of his paintings have the appearance of a theatrical realism because of the violent lighting effects. This lighting effects comes from outside the picture, highlighting the important areas and leaving the rest in dramatic shadow. This form of lighting had a decisive effect on later artists. Caravaggio's use of peasants in many of his religious paintings was criticized because of his attempt to portray ordinary, real-life people in his paintings. He included rustic and sometimes ugly sitters. This example of his work, The Supper at Emmaus, the subject of which portrays soon after Christ's execution, three of his disciples met a stranger on the road to Emmaus and invited him to supper, unaware that he was the risen Christ. During the supper, their eyes were opened and they knew him, and he vanished out of sight. When this picture was painted in 1598, it was highly controversial because of its revolutionary lifelike style with which the artist portrayed Christ and his apostles. The use of direct light from the side and above seemed to project the figures outward. This emphasized details which observers found distasteful, such as the torn sleeve of the disciple, the treatment of the basket of fruit on the table in the right foreground demonstrates Caravaggio's skill in including independent themes within a composition. He became one of the first painters of the Renaissance to introduce still life as a subject in its own right. Here is an oil of his basket of fruit, about 2 foot by 1.5 foot in size, in Milan. Caravaggio's work had an influence on many of Baroque paintings in Europe, including George de la Tour, Rubens, Rembrandt, and Velázquez. The Taking of Christ, shown here, is a recently discovered and restored Caravaggio in the National Gallery of Ireland. It was donated by the Jesuit order in Dublin. Spanish paint. The court of Spain was responsible for much encouragement and development of art and artists. El Greco, 1541 to 1614. An example of his work, Agony in the Garden. In this painting we see the elongated figure of Christ rising from the ground like a flame. About him the landscape forms, rolls, and heaves like the waves of some great ocean. Nothing is sustained. Clouds and rocks fuse and intermingle. Space is wholly ambiguous. The group of disciples sleep restlessly in an egg-shaped hollow. El Greco's philosophy was that painting should strive to express only the spiritual. Its function was most properly that of helping men's minds to rise above the materialism of the world. Dominicus Theotocopoulos, who was known in Spain simply as El Greco, the Greek, had received his earliest artistic training in his native Crete. Then he went to Venice, where the work of Titian and Tintoretto made a deep impression. But El Greco was soon to develop his own individual style. El Greco's painting was not of the taste of the austere Spanish monarchy, and although the artist was paid for his work commissioned for the palace church, it was not hung there on King Philip's orders. Toledo, city of the mystic St. John of the Cross suited El Greco's temperament perfectly. He settled in the city and there painted this great work of art, The Burial of Count Orgaz, in 1586. It is a large canvas, 16 foot by 12 foot, which emphasizes all of El Greco's mastery. His works seem to visually express the spiritual fervor of St. Ignatius Loyola, St. John of the Cross, and St. Francis Xavier shown here. Another example of his work, St. Francis, shown here, is in the National Gallery of Ireland. Spanish painting, 19th century. Francisco de Goya, 1746 to 1828. He was born in Spain and spent most of his life there. He was a successful artist in his own lifetime, becoming deputy director of the Madrid Academy. In 1785, the first painter to the King of Spain in 1789. The Sunshade, 1777, shown here, was painted as a cartoon for a tapestry. Goya was principal painter of the Royal Tapestry Works at the age of 30 and produced 63 cartoons. One of the characteristics of Goya's painting is his revelation of the isolation and vulnerability of the human being. Even when he painted a military man like the Duke of Wellington, 1812, he portrayed him not as a hero, but alone against an empty background, his face showing all the doubts, hopes, and fears which are an ever-changing feature of humanity. In the group portrait, King Charles IV and his family, 1800, Goya includes himself at his easel on the left. This painting reveals a collection of human beings as imperfect as any less exalted family. In 1792, Goya suffered an illness. He suddenly went deaf. To occupy his convalescence, he painted a few satirical works, and in 1799 he published 8 prints in the new medium of aquatint, which allowed subtle shading, savagely attacking society and the church. In 1808, the reactionary Charles IV abdicated, and Napoleon's troops invaded Spain and behaved with unprecedented savagery. Goya recorded their activities in a series of etchings called The Disasters of War, shown, between 1810 and 1813. These were not recorded until after Goya's death in 1863. He also painted a picture, the 3rd of May 1808, showing the massacre of 5,000 Spaniards by the French troops. The painting shows the terrified prisoners in disarray, in contrast to their organized, almost non-human executioners. The horrific event is highlighted by the low line with emphasis on the central figure with his outstretched arms, while at his feet his dead companions lie in their blood. The Duke of Wellington drove the French from Spain, and Goya went back to work for the Spanish court until the end of his life, when he retired to France as opposition against the monarchy increased again. He died in Bordeaux in 1828. Impressionists. The movement's title was derived from a picture by Claude Monet entitled Impression Sunrise, exhibited in 1870. The Impressionists developed a spontaneous way of painting using stroke and dashes of pure color in order to portray the color and vibration of light, the density of air. No one had ever painted the true color of sunshine and shadow, and no one had fully exploited the sensation that light dances, and hardly anyone had thought it worthwhile to suggest that the density of the air is not always constant, that a picture could be painted, for instance, through a heavy mist or fog. He becomes less and less concerned with the nature of the object, figure or landscape. He happens to be painting more and more conscious of the appearance of the object at a particular moment of time. Claude Monet, 1840 to 1926. He was the acknowledged leader of the group. The atmospheric effects of color and light dominated his canvases. From 1890, he began to paint groups of pictures. Each group was based on one subject, as shown here in the series of the facade of Rouen Cathedral in different lights. Finally, he painted the most famous series of all, the water lilies. His idea was to represent the changing aspects of the subject under various weather and time conditions. Edward Degas. Edward Degas, 1884 to 1917. Degas was technically the greatest of the Impressionists. His principal subject matter was ballet dancers. Degas, unlike other Impressionists, painted many indoor scenes, the composition of which was largely influenced by his keen interest in Japanese art. Degas was not particularly interested in the impact of light, but he was fascinated by something equally transient, the unpremeditated gesture of everyday life. His eye pounced with the swiftness of a hawk on such gestures, and he gave them an additional air of naturalness. For example, the sudden turn of the head of a woman in a cafe, the momentary gesture of a dancer, and so on. Degas also did some 72 pieces of sculpture, mostly modeled wax figures, which captured the beauty of dancers' movements. Auguste Renoir, 1841 to 1919. Renoir was the only member to be accepted by the Saloon, the official academic exhibition hall in Paris. His pictures, for the most part, have a romantic appearance because of his sensuous handling of light colors and his preference. This is an example of his work, Les Parapluies, the umbrellas. It is a beautifully composed picture. His use of carves, the umbrellas, the basket, the hoops of the girl's skirt, etc., all add to the picture's charm. This painting is in the Hugh Lane bequest and is displayed alternately between London and Dublin's Municipal Art Gallery. Auguste Rodin, 1840 to 1917. He was the most celebrated sculptor of the period and a close friend of the Impressionists. Many of the sculptures have an emotional impact because of his expressive technique of modeling. He also created a new form of sculpture, the incomplete figure, as a finished work of art. Other examples of his work are the Thinker and the Kiss, shown here. This monumental work captures the couple's moving kiss with a perfection of physical form comparable to the work of Michelangelo. The contrast of the smooth and the rough surface texture on the marble emphasizes the passion of the entwined figures.